Thanks, Lorraine. Please be seated. I gotta say, I love how well this church runs, even when the service leader isn't there. Everybody knows what to do. They get up, they get the baskets, they pass them around. It's great. It is time for our featured speaker, Mel Tidwell. Melvin was born in Lakeland, Florida. He lived on a small family farm and was a dedicated musician all through his school years, but joined the Navy at 18. After submarine training in Groton, Connecticut, he was stationed on a submarine in Hawaii. After serving on several vessels and other training duty stations, 10 years later, he left the Navy in Jacksonville, Florida. That same year, he began working for Lockheed Martin. He traveled the world as an engineer working on Navy ships throughout the U.S. and abroad. He left Lockheed in 1996. He spent the next couple of years traveling across America and worked in the summer of 1997 at Yellowstone National Park as a boiler technician, because, why not? After driving back and forth across America a few times, he then eventually took a job with Gulfstream Aerospace in Savannah, Georgia. He worked there for a couple of years, but missed his all-expense-paid traveling adventures. Go figure. His prior boss sought him out and asked him to return in 2000. The travel returned, and there was much rejoicing. Yay. In 2003, he accepted a permanent position for Lockheed in Huntsville, Alabama. There he met his one, our pianist and music director, John Pewitt. He finished his career and retired from Lockheed in 2017. At that time, he and John moved to their home in Blue Ridge, Georgia, full-time. He now spends his time cooking, gardening, and cleaning the crappers at their Airbnb and taking care of John and the two super hunter Norwegian elk hounds, Rags and Bo, the two protectors of the gardens and all-around scoundrels. Take it away, Mel.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me back again. I'm a little bit nervous. So let's talk about independence. According to Wikipedia, it's a political ideology. It says independence is a condition of a nation, country, or state in which residents and population, or some portion thereof, exercise self-government and usually sovereignty over its territory. The opposite of independence is the status of a dependent territory. Notice it mentions nothing about the independence of the individual, but of the residents and population. After all, there are no places left on earth that the peoples are free. All places have now been touched by laws. Of course, we as a society begin to think of the holiday celebrated on July 4th. It's to recognize the United States Declaration of Independence. July 4th, 1776, it was ratified by the Continental Congress and delegates, declaring we were now done with the monarchy of Britain. We've been conditioned to think of independence in these terms of country, blah, 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 nothing you didn't learn about in history class. What I want to ask is, do we the people have independence? A few years ago, my sister was visiting me, and we were in the kitchen cooking together and chatting. It was nice having her there with me doing what I love to do. The topic arose of how hard I worked even though I am retired. What she said to me was that I am living the life I had created for myself. But she is right. Everything I do is because I have chosen to do it. I'm not forced into servitude due to my country of origin and the lack of opportunity there, or the color of my skin. I am right where I want to be. I do many things that are physically demanding that most people would hate. Growing a garden, caring for flowers, sweeping floors and standing in the kitchen for hours. but this is where I want to be. Do you ever stop to think about or analyze your independence? I've been considering mine for many years now, through most of it unknowing that was my search. That is what I have conjured up in my head without knowing its name. It has been my grail, what I looked for inside but couldn't lay name to outside. As a gay man born in the early 1960s, my life had been a constant balancing of being myself while hiding in plain sight. You've heard me mention this in previous homilies, and so here it goes. Independence. I learned early in life how to do it, I guess, hide in plain sight. I've known who I was and how I wanted to love since as far back as I have memories. I also knew that every person I knew would call me faggot or queer. It was not anything positive in my circle to even think about. So I spent my childhood doing boy things. Okay, so not all boy things. I have no direct recollection or memory of this, but when I was a small boy, I loved playing with my sister. When we played together, my name was Melissa. I would not respond to anyone that didn't call me Melissa when I was in that character. Perhaps this role play is why I learned to be someone else. Maybe without her even knowing it, my precious sister was giving me tools I would need for such a long time. Weirdly enough, I do remember that when most people I didn't know spoke to me, I pretended to faint. Now picture my 5-year-old silly butt sitting on the couch with my great aunts and uncles or my great grandparents, and they would ask me something. I would just go limp and shut my eyes, y'all. Like I was Aunt Pitty Pat from Gone with the Wind getting the vapors and passing out. But back to boy things. I had crushes on girls publicly and during daylight. Then at night, I would think about all the men I found handsome and would want to marry. I'm unsure if anyone around me knew. It was not ever mentioned. There were rumors in high school of me from a certain group, but I just ignored it and continued to live. Then my first real grown-up decision, the one I made myself without anyone's help. I joined the U.S. Navy. Most of you have heard the story of how it began with a chance meeting. I had taken a giant leap towards my independence from my parents, and I think back on that now, and it was like jumping off a cliff without any worry of what I would hit. I had heard there were many others like me, and I needed to seek them out. I had always known I was at odds with society. What I didn't know was I had put myself on a collision course with the U.S. government. The big struggle within would hit me like a ton of horse bullets. I had to lie to join the Navy. Now, I had received the belt and switch enough times in my life about lying. I knew the harsh punishments that could be leveled for doing it. I didn't know it at the time or even until beginning my research for this topic that I had just put myself in the crosshairs. You see, on December 15th, 1950, a Senate report titled "Employment of Homosexuals and Other Sex Perverts in Government" is distributed to members of Congress after the federal government had covertly investigated employees' orientation at the beginning of the Cold War. The report states, since homosexuality is a mental illness, they constitute security risks to the nation because those who engage in overt acts of perversion lack the emotional stability of normal persons. Over the previous few years prior to 1950, more than 4,380 gay men and women had been discharged from the military and around 500 fired from their jobs with the government. This purging will become known as the Lavender Scare. This behavioral policy continued well into the 1990s. Gay people were openly treated as less than. We were only the bad stereotypes and all about deviancy. This is why I had to hide in plain sight for most of my adult life. I worked in the government in many capacities, from my 10 years of U.S. Naval service to my career with Lockheed Martin, traveling the globe and representing my country. I was required to maintain a security clearance until I retired in 2017. This is the impetus for having to hide in plain sight. My career and livelihood depended on it. You were not allowed to be gay and hold a security clearance with our government. Throughout all those years, I never had a real long-term relationship until my John. I was 48 years old by that time. Of course, I didn't have one during my active service years. Openly having a boyfriend would have ended my military service. Not exactly, but that's a different homily. I was active duty from 1980 to 1990. During that time, I was married twice, both times to women. The first was my attempt to live the style of life I was expected to. Married, yada, yada. That definitely didn't work. I was never able to give Marilee what she needed as a straight woman. I could never give her my total self because I was hiding. The second to a lesbian, of course, we now know the term for this is beard. But I knew that if I had a wife, I couldn't be touched, and had an excuse for why I didn't participate in most of the single sailor antics. Remember, I am 20 years old and living in Hawaii. I could just say I was home with the wife while my shipmates were out getting drunk at Korean buy-me drinky bars on Hotel Street or the Monkey Bar in Pearl City. All while I was really in Waikiki dancing under the banyan tree with my best friend Ray. Which, by the way, is still my bestie from all that way back. And as a matter of fact, I think next year might be 40 years of friendship. Anyway, we would live like this at night and then go back home or to the ship to sleep and wake up and do it all over again. We never worried about someone finding out, because if they were there, well, yeah. It really has been an amazing journey. But if I had chosen to be my true self from the beginning, none of it would have been possible. Heck, I'm unsure if I would still be alive. From where I came, it could have easily happened. Taken out to the orange grove. Heck, it was still happening in 1998. Remember Matthew Shepard? On October 7th, 1998, Matthew Shepard, a 21-year-old student at the University of Wyoming, was abducted, brutally beaten and tied to a fence outside a field in Laramie, Wyoming, and left to die, just because he was gay. But back to my security clearance. Every few years, we would have to revalidate our clearances. There was about 50 pages of very personal questions. They asked the obvious ones, from where were you born to what credit cards you had. However, there were questions about, are you a homosexual or have you ever engaged in it? Who do you live with? Do you have a girlfriend? Very probing questions to detect what they considered to be abnormalities. So I lied. This weighs upon you. Every day of your life expecting to be discovered. never imagining it would end. Loving and committed relationships in my world were almost non-existent. I had known a few lesbian couples and maybe one male couple that had been together for more than a few years. That was it. So I didn't see a happy ending for myself. It led to a lot of alcohol and drug use. All because of the ideals passed along for what, thousands of years? Just because they said it was bad? All because of an ideology I too had been raised to believe. Heck, I myself thought I was a bad person for decades. Because people and policies saw me as who I sleep with rather than who I am. They were choosing to see only one tiny portion. It didn't matter that I was anti-communist. It didn't matter that I would never betray my country for any reason. It didn't matter that my thoughts and loyalties were aligned with theirs. All that mattered was that they too had been conditioned to believe I was bad. That in and of itself was the only reason I could be blackmailed. It wasn't because I was actually a danger. It was because my society would scorn me and I would lose my career if discovered. That was the only worry. The judgment placed upon me and others that would be used against us only because they said it was bad. The government probably had more to worry about with drinking and partying than me being gay. Heck, I lived every day believing I would be outed and my career would end. So that wouldn't have changed much in my psyche. I would expect it. But if it was blamed on alcohol or drugs, that would be devastating because it's something I should be able to control. Alcoholism and drug abuse has had a big foot on my family's throat, and I would have been mortified for my career to end over that. But that was all a part of my role play of hiding in plain sight. So many of us had to perform our entire lives. Think of Rock Hudson, Tab Hunter, Martina Navratilova, Patrick Cavigliano, Arthur Nelson, Diane Wickham, Susan Maloney, John Pewitt. Walking around in a protective shell just to be able to exist like everyone else. Well, this all began to ease in the mid-1990s. The Clinton administration on December 21st, 1993, issued Defense Directive 1304.26, which directed that military applicants were not to be asked about their orientation. This policy is now known as Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and in case you're wondering, it was coined by Charles Moskos, a military sociologist. Luckily, we have progressed past this too. We are now allowed to serve fully open. We are now equal, on paper anyway. The Government Accountability Office in 1995 issued a report titled Consideration of Sexual Orientation in the Clearance Process. The report was to publish the results of an investigation into the actual use of orientation as reason for denying security clearances. There was no data collected prior to 1991 on the subject, and all reports after that indicate that orientation alone was not enough to deny a clearance. I won't get into details, but the conclusion was null. This changed the landscape of my very existence. I didn't realize it at the time, but my thoughts began to quietly wonder if I could have a life that was full and open and maintain my career. I might actually live and retire. I may not be discovered, or worse, disliked and forced out. Because you see, all it would take was someone that didn't like me or someone that had a score to settle to accuse me of being gay. Around this time, I'd taken a voluntary layoff from Lockheed for a couple of years, and I'd done a lot of driving and traveling and finally landed in Savannah, Georgia. My brother was there working for Gulfstream Aerospace, and there were opportunities for me to work there. I had been away from that good old boy mentality for a long time. I had worked with more people from New York and California, and people that didn't carry those hateful words and attitudes in their daily vocabulary. Many of them still held those beliefs, but at least they weren't so openly voiced. So let me tell you, them Savannah folk, it didn't matter to them what had been passed by the president or Congress. I felt that hostility from most men that worked there. Of course, I had friends, good, nice people that accepted me. However, just because those you worked with were not allowed to dismiss you for being gay, your life would be made a living hell. This was also the same time I came to terms with my entire family. I knew my sister and parents were aware of it, but my mother had instructed me in the beginning that she didn't want this thrown up in her face. So I never mentioned it again. Then my brother's wife, Marlene, mentioned it one day. She said, "Because you're gay?" Oh, God, my heart stopped. It had been more than 20 years since I had heard anyone in my family speak of it. No one had ever said that to me in my family. No one, ever. But that was another barrier down. I began to be more open with my family. But when I returned to work for Lockheed again in 1999, I no longer had to lie to save my clearance. However, there were still comments when my back was turned. Things you hear from coworkers that are drunk down the bar if they think you are not within earshot. Okay, anyway, this is all leading up to my continued walk to independence. Things were slowly changing around me as I traveled the world. I began to see life in a different way. As I became more comfortable knowing my career wasn't in jeopardy, I started to change inside myself. I had known for so long that I just wanted one person, one man. I didn't want the random lifestyle that had been so prevalent. If I could find just one guy that would love me and accept me for me, not the hiding guy, not the angry dude constantly trying to control everything, not this amorphous role I had assumed for so long, one foot stepping over the other, walking that line of existence but not fulfilled. If I ever found that person, I would take care of them forever. So I began changing myself. In 2006, I took a work transfer for a year back to Florida. I lived on the beach and I was home every night. I joined a gym and I lost 38 pounds. I reconnected with my family and told myself that I would give myself one more chance at this elusive dream I had of finding a loving relationship. One filled with everything that I had been told was so wonderful but couldn't have because it was wrong. Now look at me. Just look at me. I met John in February 2009, just after returning from my father's funeral in Lakeland. We became friends, and I helped him adjust to his new life after divorce. Neither of us had any gay friends or even any knowledge there was a community in Huntsville, Alabama, where we were living. Luckily, I met our dearest of friends, Rick and Fred, at my gym. They're online today. We became fast friends. friends forever, family. They opened our eyes to the life I had learned I wanted. We began to meet others, most all of them couples. It was such a different world. Most gay men were partnered and had been together for years. It wasn't a bar scene. It was a come to my house for martinis and dinner scene, my dream scene, the life I had secretly lived through television but never imagined I could have. I felt myself becoming me. Then on September 11th, 2013, me and John were on vacation in Quebec City, having dinner at Café de Paris, and it was all so serendipitous. John knew he was going to ask, but no specifics of where or how. It was fly by the seat of his pants. But there we were, eating Chateaubriand for two and homemade maple pie for dessert, an accordion player wandering among the guests, and that's when he asked me to marry him. Naturally, I said yes, of course, knowing we couldn't really get married. That wasn't available to us in Alabama until 2016 when the Supreme Court removed Roy Moore as Chief Justice in Alabama. But we continued to build our lives together. We bought our properties in this North Georgia area. After all, John had always wanted to retire here. He was finally able to get his financials revised and retire without worry. I continued to work and travel the world until it had become obvious that my job was killing me. I was never home. Even when I was in America, I worked 7 days a week. It was one FaceTime call from Saudi Arabia that made the final step within reach. I was so distraught about my coworkers. You don't need details, but just imagine being on the end of the ostracization constantly, and I was on the verge of a meltdown. My John just said, finish this job and come home. We will plan our wedding and leave this all behind. We will move to Georgia and start over as John and Mel. The final frontier, as the saying goes. That seemingly mythical place that I had convinced myself was unimaginable. Finally leaving all those walls behind, it was so freeing, so indescribable, so unimaginable up until that time. And I felt it all melt away. I'm not sure that I yet understood my newfound independence, and I don't think I even really grasped it until researching this presentation and where it would take me. I don't think I had analyzed and let myself feel all the things I had to get over myself before it could happen. All of these ideas I had heard and experienced throughout my life. I had to let that all go. I had to let it be replaced by love. I let anything negative be replaced by it. My feelings of not being enough, they were all replaced because I let myself release it all. If need be, I had a safe place. I was finally living a life independent of the role I portrayed. I no longer had to hide in plain sight. Now, the preamble to the Declaration of Independence states, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I know that freedom and independence are not the same thing. You see, politicians can pass all the laws they desire. They can tell people that my life is horrible and shouldn't be talked about with children. That's what's happening. Underneath all of the progress is still the river of people seeing us only as who we sleep with, the deviancy, if you will. Because if they looked at me hiding in plain sight, they would be talking about others. If the ones on our planet would get their brains off the sexual part and see my life as I live it, maybe we could finally be as free as the so-called heteronormative society. But you see, I think I will never be fully free. Nor will any of you until every person like me is valued by everyone. Because they aren't just stopping me from talking about it, they're also stopping you. They wish to silence the voices of tolerance. They want the silence to be able to insinuate and suggest, to continue binding others as I lived bound through all those years. But as you have heard before, we are free at last. Free from the guilt. Free from being the deviant they still propose we are. Free from their blasphemous rhetoric of Bible history. You see, I will not go back into hiding. As the nostalgic chant from the AIDS crisis in the 1980s goes, I'm here, I'm queer, get used to it. That's my independence. So take my experience word for it. True independence comes when you set yourself free. Remove the barriers taught to you, whether knowingly or unknowingly. We may be on a rocky path with many in government, and they are trying to take us in the wrong direction. But no matter how hard they try, we will not go backwards. The days of hiding in plain sight are over. I will not spend one more minute on this planet feeling ashamed of who I am. I will not kowtow to bigots and haters. Now, I've never been a huge fan of country music, probably because of the forcible listening as a child. However, recently, Mr. Garth Brooks is in my pocket. So in closing, I want to quote his song, We Shall Be Free. He sings, when the last child cries for a crust of bread, when the last man dies for just the words that he said, when there's shelter over the poorest head, we shall be free. When the last thing we notice is the color of the skin and the first thing we look for is the beauty within, when the skies and oceans are clean again, then we shall be free. We shall be free, we shall be free. Stand straight, walk proud, because we shall be free. When we're free to love anyone we choose, when this world's big enough for all different views, when we all can worship from our own kind of pew, then we shall be free. So take just a moment and think about what is holding you back. What do you need for independence? Then live what I just said and set yourself free. That's what I call independence. Thank you.
Well, can you stay up there?